They were politically very switched on. They were affectionate. They loved their wives and families. They were not without humor. They were brave. They were revolutionaries. I think that's one of the things one's got to get into one's head. 150 years before the French cut off the head of their king, and more than 2 centuries before the Russians deposed the Tsar, the English cut off their king's head, and for 11 years had a republic.
Hello and welcome to the Aspects of History podcast. My name is Oliver Webb-Carter and I'm your host. Now today I'm speaking with Robert Harris, who you heard at the top there. He's written a fantastic new novel, Act of Oblivion. The story starts in 1660, just at the restoration of King Charles II, as England emerges from Oliver Cromwell's protectorate, which we heard about recently in my chat with Miranda Malins. Robert takes as his heroes 2 Puritan regicides, men responsible for the execution of Charles I, and so you heard Robert pointing out just how extraordinary the Roundheads were. Throughout the novel we get flashbacks to the Civil War, Oliver Cromwell, and the trial of Charles I. All the while the 2 regicides are pursued to America by Charles II's agents, determined to bring them to justice as vengeance for the killing of the king. It's a fantastic book, as one has come to expect from Harris, so I do hope you enjoy our chat. Now, one thing I've wanted to mention. You might be wondering, why is there no advertising on this pod? Well, dear listener, I've had offers, but I am determined not to succumb so as to make the listening experience for you as enjoyable as possible. I myself am an avid listener to podcasts, and so when ads appear, I immediately fast forward. On an unrelated matter, if you feel like writing a nice review, and thank you to those who have already, then don't be shy. And please do subscribe if you can, I'd be hugely grateful. And so without further ado, I'll hand you over to me and Robert Harris. Robert Harris, welcome to the Aspects of History podcast. Thanks so much for joining me.
It's a pleasure to join you.
Well, we're here to talk about your new novel, Act of Oblivion, which I've read. It's brilliant as ever. I raced through it, and it's not a short novel either, actually. But I wanted to first off ask you, this is a sort of, you've not really gone into this 17th century before. It's a bit of a departure, and I wondered, is that because the period itself, which is a hugely sort of tumultuous century for Britain, or was it the characters themselves, your two main heroes, Whalley and Goffe? Was it their story that attracted you?
Well, I was attracted because I saw, I think on Twitter, just a line saying the greatest manhunt of the 17th century. And just the concept of the 2 things together caught my interest. And of course, it turned out to be the hunt for the men who'd signed King Charles I's death warrant or had sat as judges at his trial. I read a bit about it, and I thought, wouldn't it be great to invent the manhunter, the man who, because we don't know who it was, but someone must have organized this. So I sort of invented a subcommittee of the Privy Council and a clerk to the subcommittee and so on. So that was my starting point, to create the man on their tail and why he would be so determined. And then I looked at the regicides, and it was obvious to me that the 2 most interesting for my purposes would be Whalley and Goffe. They were father-in-law and son-in-law. The old man, Whalley, who was 60, was Cromwell's cousin, had been and was close to him. And they fled to America and were hunted across America for years. And I just thought that this would be a great story. It was as simple as that. I have always been interested in the English Civil War, but been deterred from writing a novel about it simply because of its complexity, really.
Yes, well, the novel stretches across many years, but the two characters themselves, Whalley and Goffe, they're very different actually, and Goffe, the younger, the son-in-law, is a little bit more earnest, Whalley is seems to have a sense of humour, actually. Rather, Goffe is less humorous. How close was that to the two men themselves?
Well, I researched and read everything there is available about them, and indeed I found out new facts about them as far as I can see that people didn't know before. For instance, the precise date of Goff's birth, which is about 7 years after most estimates. So he was younger. He was 20 years younger than his father-in-law. And Whalley's wife, her actual real name, I think I'm the first probably to track that down. But there are letters extant from them to Thurlow, Oliver Cromwell's chief secretary, that give us some insight into their characters. And there are letters between Goffe, the son-in-law, and his wife back in England. And these do give you a flavour of their character. And it is true that Whalley was, I think, a far more confident man. He was from a background of the gentry, although they'd fallen on hard times. He comes across as confident. He was considered a bit of a dandy. He was also definitely a political moderate. For instance, he urged moderation on Cromwell when he set off on his expedition to Ireland, and mercifully neither of the two men went on that expedition. And Goffe, we know from the Putney debates, was a fiery, kind of almost a fifth monarchist man, believed that Christ would return to earth in 1666. And he was a political extremist and very much against any negotiations with the king. And curiously, this hasn't really been touched on by writers about the regicides. Whalley, for about 9 months, was the king's jailer when he was in the army's hands. He was in charge of him. So he seems to become quite close to Charles, as well as being close to Cromwell. So there were lots of straws that I could use to build the bricks of the characters.
I'm glad you mentioned that brief, well, as you say, 9 months or so, where he's the jailer of Charles. I've increasingly, more I learn about this period, have more sympathy for Charles, and he comes across as rather a sympathetic figure in your book. I wondered if you felt the same.
Well, until I really got into writing the novel, I hadn't appreciated how clever he had been at the trial, and how the regicides, when they were caught and they were hanged, drawn and quartered, almost to a man, I think, died very bravely, died in the certainty of that they were right. And Charles I on the scaffold died very bravely in the certainty that he was right as well. And I found that the mirror image of the two, that inner certainty, was interesting. And I did have some sympathy for him. I mean, I started the book, I've always regarded myself rather lazily, assumed that I would be a roundhead. But having spent a lot of time in the company of these Puritan colonels, I decided that quite probably I'm one of nature's cavaliers, actually. It was it's technically easier, frankly, to write about King Charles I than it is to write about two Puritan colonels on the run. There were many times when I thought, what on earth have I done? What sort of task have I set myself here to make these figures comprehensible and sympathetic to a reader?
Because their idea of sort of leisure time is reading the Bible, isn't it? Which, a great read, but it's not Netflix. So they didn't have that in those days. In sort of permanent reading of the Bible was providing a lot of fulfillment for them.
Yes, they were, exactly. I mean, I steeped myself during the research in the writings and speeches of Oliver Cromwell and all the others, and every other sentence is a biblical quotation practically. And this is sort of, if you want to be honest about what these people were like. This is the total kind of motivation and explanation for the world around them and everything. Having said that, let's look for the points of similarity. They were politically very switched on. They were affectionate. They loved their wives and families. They were not without humor. They were brave. They were revolutionaries. I think that's one of the things one's got to get into one's head. 150 years before the French cut off the head of their king, and more than 2 centuries before the Russians deposed the Tsar, the English cut off their king's head, and for 11 years had a republic. That's quite an extraordinary thing. That was what these men were capable of. They weren't just sort of dreamy kind of religious nutcases, as we might see them. So there was more to build on, to make these figures substantial to a modern reader. One of the things that I decided quite early on was to call them Ned and Will, which I think they probably would have been called by their contemporaries. That humanized them. And in a way, the novel was a kind of Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid of Puritan, and his Puritans on the run, pursued by this invented regicide hunter of mine called Richard Naylor. And a chase story, you can't beat a chase story really for fiction. And so the narrative spine of the book is a chase with flashbacks to the Civil War. And I hope that, this is a way of writing about the Civil War which makes it accessible for the general reader.
Yes, it's certainly worked for me, because I'm not really a scholar of this period in any way. Interestingly, it's funny, I was talking to a Catholic priest a couple of days ago who is a scholar of the period, and I was asking him about the religious aspect, which I think you dealt with actually quite well in the book, because you do connect with these characters. But the fact that in that period everyone was it was a lot more religious than we are today, but this priest was telling me that it was quite a new way of connecting with God in the period, because you'd had the advent of the printing press recently and translation of the Bible from Latin into another language. So you didn't need your priest, and you just needed the Bible, which these two, Goffe and Whalley, have. They have their Bible, and that's their connection into God. And it was, I think it's portrayed quite well in the novel. It's an interesting vision of a period that we're not really that familiar with.
Yes, I think that it's a time of revolution. I think the modern world is really being forged in these decades in the mid 17th century. And that's right. The Puritans felt that a man could have a relationship with God, which was in essence personal, really, that you could do away with all this foppery and flummery of priests and vestments and stained glass windows and bishops, and the idea that the king was in charge, head of the religion. I mean, just sweep that all aside and just, in a modern way, really, have faith, have a community forms itself to worship God. And this is radicalism. And of course, it has a political dimension, because you're attacking the established order. And this obviously gels with the entrepreneurial class, who are often represented by Puritanism. And so hence this endless debate as how much of the English Civil War was religion and how much of it was economic, and how much of it was politics, which does make it very complex to write about, because really there are at least 3 in this Civil War. There's the Parliament, there's the King, and there's the army, which is very much founded upon religion, especially the Cromwellian part of it. Religion is absolutely central, so you cannot escape it. And this is one of the reasons why I think that it's not a period that's covered particularly often in popular fiction, or in films or television series. There's been a great many, and very many very good recent books about the English Civil War. They've been coming out in the last year or two, but not very many novels have ever been written. I think because the characters can be very hard for a modern reader to get their head around.
Mm. And you mentioned the politics of things, and I know you've said before that politics is the drama of life. Now, the Civil War, the trial of the king, the execution, and then the interregnum, and then the restoration. I mean, it's so dramatic, and all in quite a short period. And that's I'm not even including the plague and the Great Fire of London, all within the space of 17 years. It's well, I guess the Civil War is a lot further, so it's over a lot longer. But you know, a huge amount packed into a short period. How dramatic! I mean, it almost writes itself, I suppose, in a way.
Well, to some degree, yes, and of course, it's you really, as you mentioned at the beginning, the book is quite a long novel. It's my second longest, after An Officer and a Spy, and I still have cut out a lot actually, or chose not to write it. But I wanted to give both the novel begins in 1660 with Whalley and Goffe arriving in New England, and on the same day, more or less, actually it's a historical fact, the death warrant was discovered in a country house in Leicestershire. So these things happen more or less on the same day, and from that point on, I cut between the pursuer and the pursued. But because Whalley was himself Cromwell's cousin, and I think this has been underplayed, he was more or less the same age as Cromwell. They must have grown up together. To a degree, they went to Cambridge at the same time. They lived in London, within a few streets of one another for a time. And when Cromwell started building up what became the Ironsides, one of the first people he turned to help him build it was his cousin, and he eventually rose to be commander of the cavalry and very much really effectively in charge of Cromwell's personal security when he was protector and lived next door to the palace where Cromwell lived. So he provided me with a perfect vantage point for the whole history of the period. And anyone who knows about that time knows that a lot of people, like Ludlow, for instance, Hutchinson, they wrote memoirs. And so this is almost the first period when you find that politicians or political actors are actually writing their story. So it's perfectly feasible, given that Whalley had years on his hands of just hiding in attics and barns, that he might start to write his memoir. And that enabled me to tell the story, the most interesting parts of the story, which he would have witnessed. That is the founding of Cromwell's regiment, the battles, he was in charge of the king's, looking after the king, as I say, and then we go on to the trial and execution of the king. He was both the judge and signature of the death warrant, and so on. So, I was able to interleave these two aspects of the story, and I've put, not only, as you say, the drama of the execution, but I mean Cromwell's rough and ready habits with Parliament, are incredibly dramatic, where he shuts down Parliament and tells them to clear off, locks the door, pockets the key, and walks up to his house and throws it down in front of the assembled army officers. It's an incredibly dramatic scene. Why on earth there's a statue to Oliver Cromwell outside the Houses of Parliament, I do not know, as no one in history seems to have shut it down more often than he did.
Yeah, it is very funny that. I was going to leave Cromwell till later, but we should talk about him because I've always had a kind of strange fascination with Cromwell, and I wondered what your view of him was. I think I can I might be able to tell from what you just said, but he is a hugely divisive figure, but has had a little bit of a sort of there's been a few revisionist histories of him recently. He's coming over as a little less sort of on the kind of hugely. He's becoming a little bit more sympathetic recently. In some histories.
Well, he was a force of nature, and he was a great man, and his achievement is staggering, to have gone from a moderately well-off farmer and kind of, as it were, backbench MP, with, as far as we know, no military training whatsoever, to found and lead what became probably the greatest army in the world, and to completely destroy the professional soldiers on the other side. He was inspirational, brilliant, and a curious mixture of qualities, of ruthlessness and violence and compassion and sentiment, and with a most marvelous way with language. The thing you can't, and you can never sort out with Cromwell, is how much of the religion is genuine. I think almost all of it, but how much of it is also delusional or self-interest. And that is, and how ambitious was he? I mean, I think there's little doubt when you look at it that he was extremely ambitious, and saw that there was a route opening up for him to take absolute power, and he obviously reveled in power. But one of the reasons he was able to do it was because even his enemies grudgingly accepted that Cromwell was the biggest man in the country. Once the king was dead and his son was in exile, there was only Cromwell. And as long as Cromwell was on the scene, more or less the show could hold together the Commonwealth. The moment, of course, he was removed, then there wasn't anyone with his stature. I think we can debate endlessly, because the evidence is inconclusive. He was a very secretive man, I think, in terms of what was going on in his head and what he was planning. So we can debate endlessly whether he was a good thing or a bad thing, to use the cliche. But sure as hell, he was a thing, one of the most remarkable men that this country's ever produced.
One thing I wanted to ask was, you've mentioned your research, and you've uncovered these previously unknown facts, which is extraordinary, and you refer to that immediately in your author's note. There were a few other parts in the book that I was interested to know if you'd researched. For example, full moons, dates of full moons. I'd imagine is there an app for something like that, or had you, is this sort of, how much research did you go into to find out about that?
Well, it's not an app, but there are sites on the internet that give you, first of all, the days of the week. I'm always interested, because the days of the week, they have a different feel. So you can find out what the day of the week was under the old calendar that was still in force at the time. And you can find all the phases of the moon in the 17th century in New England. So I did, there's a lot of the book takes place at night. They can only get outside at night. They have to travel if they're trying to shift between hiding places at night. Full moons are important, a matter of life and death. So yeah, I wanted to get them right. So I'm afraid that nerdishly, that kind of thing is as accurate as I could make it. I have to believe the thing is true before I can put it down. And if I feel that, oh my God, that is what happened, or then I can sort of try to bring it alive better. And all the historical novels that I've done, it's that excitement of feeling, my God, it might have been something like this, or it must have been something like this, whether it be in Roman times or in the 17th century.
Oh, that's wonderful. The novel, our two fugitives hold out in America, which is a new colony for, almost it's a new country for so many people. Well, actually, not that many. They're actually population-wise not that many there, but it's this extraordinary description that you've captured of America, these new town, Boston and Cambridge and New Haven. Uh, it must have been an extraordinary place for people who were, I guess, they were fleeing religious persecution and so starting out afresh. But I wondered, uh, in your research of America, how you found these sort of actually tiny settlements, really, aren't they?
Yes, they are. Only 100 or 200 people quite often. This is the part of the book which I found most interesting to write, actually, because this is a country just beginning to be born. I mean, we should say specifically, of course, it was a country that existed for a long time, thousands of years before, with an indigenous population. But the English have arrived in this area, and they are creating a new England, literally. And that is fascinating. First of all, one realizes just how important religion was. To land in these places, to trek 50, 100 miles inland, to brave all the elements, to plant crops, build houses in the middle of nowhere, in the silence of these great virgin forests and so on. You could only do that if you believed you were doing God's work, which of course is very much what the Roundheads did in the Civil War, the soldiers. They believed they were God's instruments. So right in the DNA of America, which exists to this day, is religious fundamentalism. And that I found fascinating, all these Puritan settlements. And yes, they were founded by people fleeing religious persecution, and they wanted to worship God in their own way. And you can still see, anyone who goes to modern America now, is one of the things that's most striking is the religious radio stations, for instance, or we see now in Roe v. Wade, or in Prohibition. You see the essence of a very, very strong religious streak in America, for all the variety of races and religions that are there. Still, there is still this very strong element that you can trace back to those early pioneers.
I read Thomas Pynchon's novel Mason and Dixon, set sort of 100 years or so later, and there's that other element in America which I guess is just brewing in your novel of there's this a kind of I don't know if it's rebelliousness, but a kind of wildness to the people in America that is certainly different to England.
Yeah, well, bear in mind that when Whalley and Goffe got to New Haven and they drilled the militia, which was designed to protect the town against the Native American threat, New Haven was the religious settlement, extreme even by Puritan standards, that they said openly. Whalley said, with 200 such men as you, we need have no fear of the King of England. He's recorded as saying that. And so here we are in 1661, more than a century before the American War of Independence. You have the first kind of whiff of republicanism and separation from the English state. The guys who cut off the king's head, their descendants are the people who settle in New England. And lo and behold, that strain runs through American politics and American thinking, the rugged individualism, the kind of person that can actually build a house and live in that sort of hostile environment. All these things are trace elements that you can see in modern America. And that's, I hadn't appreciated till I was writing the novel, the links between Cromwell, the parliamentary side, and the Puritan Revolution in England, and America and the American Revolution. But they are extremely strong.
Now, one other area that I think you write and really draw attention to quite well is the very well is the female aspect, but childbirth, death in childbirth. I mean, even the voyage over from England to America, which is what, 2 or 3 months, uh, with heavily pregnant women on those ships. It's just the suffering of females then is vividly portrayed, actually, and it's something that I guess one doesn't initially appreciate, in the wider scheme of the politics and the drama of the period.
Yes, so many of the characters who I put in the book were on their second wife, and almost all of them, the first wife had died in childbirth, and it must have been hellish. In fact, when they are discussing the regicides, the possibility, the prospect of hanging, drawing, and quartering, the notion was that actually any ordinary woman probably had gone through equivalent pain and goes through it every year practically, and a lot of them die at the end of it. So yes, women are the kind of heroes in a way. I mean, they hold the families together when the men are on the run, and they are pragmatic and sensible. They don't have political power, and obviously they're not soldiers, but they are, really crucial. And there are a couple of very strong women in the book, and I liked the fact that was realistic, that I wasn't writing some kind of kick-ass, 17th century maiden, or I hate that in contemporary fiction, that you've now got to make the women all like men and killing people and the rest of it. They were very formidable, but in a different way and a more impressive way in some ways.
And now you've briefly mentioned Samuel Pepys in the novel, but he doesn't actually make an appearance. Were you reluctant to bring in such a sort of huge figure?
Well, I think the only thing you can do really with these books is to bring in whatever is relevant and they would have encountered. I mean, Whalley and Goffe would not have encountered Samuel Pepys. It's true that the guy who is hunting them, the clerk to the Regicide Committee, he would probably have known who Pepys was. And yes, I couldn't resist when the regicides were brought back. 3 of them later on were captured in Holland and brought back. They were met by a barge, and I couldn't resist saying that Mr. Pepys had, the Secretary of the Navy Board, had sent the barge to take them off the ship and take them to the Tower, which I think is perfectly plausible. In fact, I'm not sure that he didn't actually do it. But anyway, the incident is mentioned in his diaries. So yes, I mean, one of the things that in historical fiction is you can only really use about 1 fact in 20 that you've discovered, and by and large, one should avoid the one character observing to another, look, there's Pepys. He always seems to be writing. For God's sake, we mustn't have that. The book is sprinkled, well, in fact, almost entirely peopled by real characters. There's only Naylor, my regicide hunter, is a fictional character. Almost everybody else, Clarendon, Cromwell, the reverends in New England, all of them did actually exist. But I don't want to hang around too much. The reader wants the story, really, rather than for me to just parade my notes.
So Whalley and Goffe, I mean, and certainly we won't discuss any spoilers, but Whalley and Goffe's time is in as fugitives from Naylor. I wondered, and they weren't the only ones, obviously, the regicides that were abroad and trying to escape from the clutches of Charles II. I wondered how, because you do describe, as you've mentioned, you describe some of the regicides, their executions, and they do go out as brave men. I wondered, life on the run isn't hugely fun. I wondered if any of them had any regrets, and obviously you've gone into their minds, so it's interesting to see what you would think about that. Would it have been better for them to have returned to London, face the music, and die?
Well, I think that was a source of debate. Yes, I mean, I think from the regicides who went on the run. I mean, we should perhaps explain that when it also gives the name of the book, that when the king returned and Charles II came to the throne in 1660, a kind of general amnesty for the Civil War was introduced in Parliament, called the Act of Getting an Oblivion, with one exception, really, and that was for anyone who'd had a hand in the death of Charles I. And the 30, 40, whatever it was, people who were still alive, 50 maybe, who'd sat as judges, or in particular had signed a death warrant, they were marked down and they had to hand themselves in the hope of justice and some mercy. And some of them did, poor fools, and they didn't get much mercy, actually. The best they could have hoped for, by and large, was life imprisonment. And life meant life, and imprisonment was pretty grim. But others went on the run, and there was a debate as to whether it was better, especially among those who were very, very strongly religious, whether it wasn't better to simply go to your martyr's death. General Harrison, one of the most flamboyant leaders of the parliamentary side in the Civil War, he just allowed himself to be taken, and he died not merely bravely, but actually he threw a punch at the executioner when he was having his insides dragged out. I mean, these were tough people, but certainly some of them, there was a speech from the scaffold by, I think, Colonel Jones, saying better by far to be here now on the brink of meeting our Maker in heaven than these, people who've gone on the run. And so I was able to put that into the novel. I think that Whalley, what one knows of him, the pragmatic older father-in-law, would have thought better to try and live and fight another day. Goffe, I wouldn't be at all surprised if he wasn't one of those who said, we've made a terrible mistake, we should never have come here, because their lives were miserable. It's funny that a lot of the ideas and work on this novel came during lockdown, and because they lived lives of lockdown, essentially. They could not go out of doors. And we all know how that felt. And they simply had to hide, like Anne Frank, in an attic for years at a time. But I think that it is questionable whether it would have been better to just sort of get it over with, and whether they had much of a life actually in
America. And then, do you think Charles I, his execution, do you think that was healthy for the country? And I guess I'm talking, many years later, 100, 200 years later.
Well, they came close, really breathtakingly close to a kind of 1688 settlement, 40 odd years, 50 years beforehand. And but the fact of the matter is that Charles I was, he regarded himself as free to be as duplicitous as he liked, because he had God on his side, just as Cromwell and the rest thought that they had God on their side, and that they would be forgiven for whatever corners they cut, crimes they committed, because ultimately they were doing God's will. So it was impossible really to do a deal with Charles I, and I think that they were right to that extent. That he had to be got rid of. Whether a trial was the right way, I don't know, because of course, like many political leader, Charles I was able to use the trial as a platform for himself, and he had the best of it. I mean, in the end, they had to try him in absentia, because every time they brought him out, he would say, oh, before we go any further, under what law am I being tried? And of course, they couldn't really answer this. And his behavior at the trial, and the fact that this became a pamphlet and was read everywhere, his arguments, and then the execution when he was so supremely self-assured during it, were propaganda victorious for him. So there is a case that the army would have been far better to have just bumped him off whilst he was trying to escape, which he repeatedly did try to escape, and then maybe they could have done some sort of deal with, if not Charles' son, one of the other children. But we'll never know. I think that by that time Cromwell was determined to, as he said, cut off the king's head with the crown still upon it, i.e., to dispense with this figure who had, as far as they were concerned, was an impediment both to peace and to the relationship between people and God. They wanted to get rid of the head of the church and the bishops all in one fell swoop. A revolution. That is the breathtaking thing. I think that people often forget just what an extraordinary thing this was.
So I know you've mentioned earlier on. You mentioned you're sort of angling towards being a cavalier rather than a roundhead. So if you had to choose, which would it be?
Well, obviously, I'm drawn to the radicalism of giving everyone their destiny, and this is something we haven't mentioned, the levelers, of course, and the fight within the army for a universal franchise, which Cromwell ruthlessly suppressed. And
those ideas are just hugely revolutionary. Hundreds of years before.
Incredible. So as a 21st century person, of course, I find all those ideas very attractive. What I don't find attractive and what I find alienating is the Puritanism of the army, which is remarkably similar in some respects to ISIS or Al-Qaeda. It's a kind of Protestant Taliban, smashing up images, destroying and desecrating things they don't believe in, forbidding, suppressing music in services, festivals, theatre, entertainment. That rigidity, that ruthlessness, I find distinctly unappealing. But I kind of accept what Carlyle wrote. I must be one of the very few people who, in recent years, has read Carlyle's life of Cromwell. And he thinks that it was the one time in British history when the greatest people were in charge, when this was the most noble, the most extraordinary, thought through experiment in a new form of life and way of living, so I can see that. So when I say I'm a cavalier, I suppose what I mean by that is I like a drink and a song, and I'm going to the theatre, and I find this crazy kind of millennial God will, Christ will return in 1666. Leaves me completely cold.
I'm glad to hear it. Right. Well, Robert, thank you so much for your time. My final question is: Are you remaining in this kind of period, or a few hundred years either side, or have you decided on your next novel?
I don't know what I'm going to do next. I have a couple of ideas, but this was quite a hard book to write, as you can probably imagine. But no, I said I'm not going to do a sequel or a prequel. I've always
The Glorious Revolution. That's a. Yeah.
I've always wanted to write about the English Civil War. It's fascinated me, and now I hope I've found a way of doing it. And that will probably be it for me.
Well, you certainly have. It's a fantastic read. Thank you very much for coming on.
Thanks, Oliver. Good to talk to you.
Now, as I have mentioned more than once to Robert and to you, I really do recommend this book. Links are in the show notes. If you're really committed, I put a link to Thomas Carlyle's book on Cromwell, so I'd be very impressed if you managed to read that. Coming up, I've got Ben McIntyre on Colditz, the prison of prisons during the Second World War, so I hope you can join me then. In the meantime, thank you and good night.